Thank you all for joining us today. My name is John Horning, and I'm the Executive Director of WildEarth Guardians. We've got Guardian supporters from all over the country taking part in this webinar. Check the registrations. We got people in Maine, Ohio, Illinois, DC, of course, and all over the Western United States. And while the virtual doesn't replace the in-person, I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that we now do these things and it creates ease of connection, and there's a real benefit to that. So I like to think about the positive side of these difficult last 18 months. In these WildEarth webinars, we like to bring together issue experts and people from frontline communities, elected officials, and WildEarth Guardian staff to talk about critical issues at a critical time. And our purpose is, as always, to inform, inspire, and activate Guardians like you to help us advance our vision and create the kind of world that we want. I'll be taking questions from the audience on the half hour and towards the end of our webinar, so please post your questions in the chat box. Today, we'll be talking about the matter of restoring our national forests and healing watersheds and waterways from the legacy of damage from old logging roads, many of them poorly built and poorly located and falling apart. And with me today, I'm very excited to discuss these matters, is Congresswoman Kim Schrier, who represents the people of Washington's 8th Congressional District. Representative Schrier, who's in her second term, is a champion of the Legacy Roads and Trails program. She's joining us from Washington, DC, which is my hometown. About halfway through the conversation, Representative Schrier will depart, get back to work, and I'll be joined by Marlise Wirenga, a WildEarth Guardian staffer and longtime champion of the Legacy Roads and Trails program, and Jessica Helsley, the Washington State Director for the Wild Salmon Center. So, welcome Representative Schrier to our WildEarth Guardians webinar series.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome, and it's wonderful to see you, and it's wonderful to see Marlise and also Jessica. And I'm looking at the river behind you, and it is making me want to go walk in there with a fishing rod. Thank you for having me. And I also am going to just take a little bit of liberty. A little bird told me today might be your birthday. So happy birthday.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm celebrating in lots of ways, and one of the ways to celebrate is to have this conversation. So again, I appreciate you being here. I'd like to start the discussion just by learning a little bit more about yourself. In terms of Congress, you're relatively new at the 3-year mark, and you've had a long career in healthcare. Can you talk about the passion that leads you from being a pediatrician to deciding to run for Congress?
Well, sure, of course. You know, I think there's a reason that I am the first pediatrician ever in Congress, and it's, you know, pediatricians are generally really happy people taking care of kids and their families. And that is what I was doing happily for about 20 years. What ultimately prompted me to run was the 2016 election of a president who was intent on doing a lot of things that I thought would be very harmful to children and families. Everything from undermining the Affordable Care Act, to nasty name calling on the playground, to undermining climate protections and environmental protections that I think we owe to our children, public education, you name it. So that is what propelled me to run for office, first time ever. And boy, was that a transition, and I ran and won and became one of the women in the 2018 class that changed the face of Congress.
How cool. I love that story. As you were speaking, I actually had this image of my pediatrician when I was a child, and just what you said, they're happy, they're nurturing. So lovely to think about those qualities. And again, my own pediatrician from many, many years ago. Just want to talk about your perspective from your district to give our listeners, again, who are from all over the country, a little bit of sense of where you're from. It's, I know, urban and rural and wild areas, a couple of national forests and even 2 national parks. Yeah. Why for you does watershed health and the environment, why does it matter? Why should we care?
Well, first of all, we should all care about our watersheds and health of our water. My district, as you mentioned, is very diverse in nearly every way, and it spans the Cascade Mountains. So I cover, the suburbs of Seattle, suburbia, and even some kind of slightly urban areas, into exurban areas, and then these wild lands that you're talking about that are so important to protect. And our watersheds, if you want to look at them from a very selfish standpoint, it's to take care of our drinking water. But the reality is that everything depends on our watersheds, right? Like Puget Sound's health depends on our watersheds, and the survival of salmon and steelhead that are migrating depends on the health of our watersheds and the riparian habitat. And so, if we have an interest in any part of our ecology, it really all starts with protecting our watersheds.
Yeah, so important. That also just thinking about national forests and their importance to our drinking water. They're where so much of our drinking water supplies come from. And of course, the wildness feeds our souls too. So yes. I want to shift and talk about a program that I know is near and dear to your heart and has been a longstanding priority for WildEarth Guardians, which is the Legacy Roads and Trails program. Can you give our listeners here with some broad strokes a sense of both what it is and what inspired you to champion it in Congress?
Absolutely. WildEarth Guardians has probably known about Legacy Roads and Trails far longer than I have. I'm just in my 3rd year in Congress. And, what appealed immediately is that this program, I just feel like it was born for Washington State. And in a lot of ways it was. So Norm Dix, Congressman from Washington State, worked with Mike Anderson, and they were the brain children of this program. And the idea is that we have all these roads in our national forests. Many of them were used for logging way back when. They're falling apart, and they need to either be decommissioned or renovated. And if you apportion the funding that's already there for roads, like in infrastructure packages, it really never makes its way down to the projects that are there to preserve stream habitat, watershed health. It's always for logging or for some other kind of resource extraction, because the money always talks. And so this is a program that specifically targets projects that will protect our waterways, riparian habitat. It will replace blocked culverts. And if roads are necessary, it'll shore them up. And if roads are no longer necessary, if they're washed out, if they're putting sediment into rivers, then it decommissions those roads and maybe creates a hiking trail instead, so that we can, as you mentioned, feed our souls.
Yeah. Was there a moment in your first year that you can share from either your staff or yourself where you said, this is a cool program, I want to champion it?
Oh, I instantly thought it was an amazing program. I mean, it really does sound like a Washington State program. And the idea of fighting for infrastructure resources from the standpoint of conservation and habitat restoration is just, it's so upside down compared to everything else in Congress, that I loved it right away. And there's a lot of ways to protect our wild lands and our national forests. This is one of them. The other one that I think is top of mind for everybody is forest health in terms of thinning underbrush and kind of resilient forests to prevent wildfires. And we can talk about that later, but that is a really important reason to have some of those roads that we do still need repaired.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the enthusiasm with which you articulate the commitment, and just from a Guardian's perspective, it's great to have champions in Congress on issues that matter, and champions who just embody the commitment to the cause. So just appreciate that. You mentioned roads. Roads are on national forests are a significant concern. In Washington State, as you've referenced, there alone, there are some 21,000 miles of roads just on the national forest in the state of Washington. Overall, it's something like 365,000 miles of roads, and the Forest Service knows that this is a problem that they can't manage. We obviously use these roads, just to be clear, some of them to get to favorite trailheads and campgrounds and fishing spots. But as I said, there's a long recognition that the network of roads is massive, and it creates all kinds of problems. Can you talk about, you mentioned culverts, but can you talk about both a little bit more about the nature of the problem and how a program like Legacy Roads and Trails can help address the problem?
Absolutely. I think maybe the best way to illustrate the problem is to just tell you an example that I heard from Eleanor on my staff. And she was out with some conservation groups and saw a Forest Service road that had been washed out. And because it had been washed out, every time it rained, water would now find an alternate path right through that decommissioned road. It would carry all the rock and the sediment down. It put, sand and debris in the water so that it couldn't be good spawning habitat for salmon. And also with all that sediment, it blocked culverts. So there was no passage, there was no spawning. And we talk about wanting to preserve and expand our salmon population. And that involves, all elements of their life cycle and their habitat. So, part of that happens in the sound and taking care of predation. Part of it happens with dams and having good fish passage. Part of that happens in the headwaters in our national forests. And so this was a perfect example where Legacy Roads and Trails dollars could employ local excavators and contractors to decommission that road, put in a hiking trail, make sure we didn't have continued erosion, and then you've got a win-win situation.
Yep. It's, it's great also to be thinking about how to support a cultural shift within the Forest Service from the extractive mindset that dictated the culture and their policies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even to some extent through today, but to a more restorative one. And that's why I'm so excited about the work that's been done and the hoped for making it a more permanent part of making it permanent to ensure that we've got the funding to do the work every year. You mentioned culverts, the pipes that are under roads. I know, and again, you mentioned that salmon have problems with culverts. Why? Salmon, of course, are iconic and culturally significant. But can you talk just a little bit more about why salmon and the scale of the problem with culverts?
Yeah. So culverts are essentially pipes under roads. And what we have found over time is that the culverts that were put in place, they're really not big enough for the scale. Sometimes they're not even at the right elevation. So the salmon can't even jump high enough to get into the culvert to make their way upstream. And so there are, because this impacts salmon populations and treaty rights, there is a many millions of dollars worth of culvert replacement going on in Washington state in order to create that passage with much bigger culverts. And so scaling them right and doing them right and making sure they don't get clogged with debris is part of what legacy roads and trails can accomplish in our national forests.
That's great. I'm curious how many tribes you have in your district. I imagine you have a handful.
Yeah, in the district proper, I would say two or three, depending on whether you count the Puyallup technically as being in the district. So, and Yakima may extend a little bit into the district as well. So yeah, we have tribes here and all over Washington state. And I mean, really, again, watersheds all lead to the same place, right? They lead to the sound. And so really this affects all tribal treaty rights and frankly, our obligation, not just to them, but just to our natural environment to take what we need, but not more than what we need, and to remediate and make up for some of the things we've done in the past, where the entire economy of Washington state was either logging or damming. And that is just what happened in Washington 100 years ago. And so we need to make sure that we remedy some of the damage that was done.
Yeah, appreciate that. I have a question from the chat box that I'd like to put out there now. It's from the Olympic Forest Coalition on the Olympic Peninsula. Thank you, Representative Schrier, for all your work. Can you connect the dots with how the infrastructure bill can help amplify this program? If it does, what should we be concerned about to push forward? Barriers in our Washington delegation or opportunities? And then one more piece of this, culvert removal is not only an issue, but key to save some restoration downstream. Can these be moved up the priority list for funding? So a bunch of different questions, starting with the infrastructure bill and how this fits.
Yeah, why don't we start with the infrastructure bill? So first of all, we were very excited when we saw legacy roads and trails as its own line item in the president's budget. That was a big deal because it had fallen off and it didn't have funding in 2019. So seeing it back meant, aha, this is a priority for President Biden. This is on the list. And then the bipartisan infrastructure plan is a really big deal. And I know it's being downplayed by some as not being enough, but let's not forget $1 trillion is nothing to shake a stick at. Like, this is a big deal. And it has in that $100 million for legacy roads and trails. And as long as it doesn't violate any detailed parliamentarian double dipping provisions, the Build Back Better, we are hoping to get another $450 million in there. And of course, that will depend on the ultimate size and scope of the package. But we have, let's see, from David, it won't be 3 trillion. Yeah. So the question of what gets cut, I'm seeing that question come in right now. So we've got the 1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure plan. We've got the 3.5 trillion proposed Build Back Better plan. It will probably come in, I am told on good authority from the president, somewhere between 1.9 and 2.2, although I'm not certain that that is the case if Joe Manchin really sticks with 1.5 as his top number. And so the question now is, do you do everything but do it smaller and shorter? Or do you just pick out some big winners? And that is an ongoing discussion with the president. So this is an important one. And at a minimum, then we have 100 million in the bipartisan plan that will get passed.
Do you have any connections with Joe Manchin? Just thinking about how just frustrated from seeing him whittle away at the vision here and wanting him to understand the urgency of everything that is in the package and not wanting things like the legacy roads and trails funding to be cut in half. So.
Yeah, I think, I think frustration is shared all around. I don't have enough connection. I don't have a personal relationship with him. But I do always keep in mind that the only reason we can even talk about having a reconciliation Build Back Better bill is that we have a 50-50 Senate, and you don't get a 50-50 Senate unless you have some senators from really, really tough states. And that he is from West Virginia, where I believe the Republican Democratic split, I mean, I think it's something like a Trump plus 40 district. Like it's a district where it's very hard for a Democrat to win. So I will be thankful that we can get anything through and understand some of his constraints. But I feel that way about this, and also clearly about voting rights, which matters everywhere.
Sure. Yeah, these are delicate matters, and putting together a coalition to deliver on these big issues that are critical to our survival and to all kinds of critical things, whether it's, as you said, voting rights or the health of our national forests, requires this combination of diplomacy and I'm sure a little bit of a bulldog nature too, to not let go of the vision. So,
well, here's how I look at it, John. If we can do this right, even if it isn't at the scale that some would dream of, it's still going to be a big deal. And if we can do it right, we can execute this well, and we should be able to provide really good evidence about what gets accomplished when you exercise your voting rights, and that may then buy us another bite at the apple in the future to do more of the same. So I think those are all, factoring into decisions about how we implement Build Back Better.
Yep. I think the challenge that I hear from our members, and that I share too, is we live at a time where not to say that $1 trillion is incremental, but where the scale of the problems requires the boldness and ambition that the Biden administration has articulated in policy and in legislative proposals and in its rhetoric. And as it has the potential to be whittled down, it's not to the scale of the problem given the urgency of the moment. And so there's this, I grew up in DC, I understand that matters inside the Beltway require all kinds of messiness. And so I agree with you that you build faith in democracy and the ability of Congress to get things done. And hopefully that's a building block for more, even as the impatient side of me wants more. Let me get another question from
and
Jeff.
I feel that same impatience. Can I just make one more comment, which is that it's very interesting to see that even before congressional action, simply the signal from an administration and a Congress that is committed to climate action has already shown results in American car companies saying they're converting entirely to electric fleets, to some of our oil and gas companies investing in wind and solar and carbon capture. So even if Congress doesn't do everything, and we're going to try to do everything, but it has already set off a positive cascade of events. And I think we should also feel inspired by that and the work that is going on in cities, counties, and states all across the country.
Yeah, I love the positive reframe. I say to people when they ask me about whether or not I am cynical, if I were cynical, I couldn't do the work. And I believe in your position, we don't want to give in to cynicism. So I appreciate, again, your optimism and belief in the role of Congress in being a trophic cascade of sorts, thinking ecologically speaking. So again, I appreciate that. Just another question. Under the Yakima River Integrated Plan, snowpack is counted on as a reservoir. Roads and trails become accelerated first order streams under snowmelt. A little technical here. Would you support increased funding for the Okanagan Wenatchee share of Legacy Roads and Trails funds to remove and restore the upper Yakima watershed?
So I would tend to not pick favorites, but I think that you make an excellent point, and that as the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan was conceived as a way to fairly partition and conserve water for salmon, for agriculture, and for people, that there were assumptions about snowpack and reservoir levels. And we need to be thinking about whether those are accurate and reliable. So thank you for raising that question.
Yeah, and I should have named, that one was, excuse me, from Judy Hollisey. So thank you, Judy.
Thanks, Judy.
One more, and then I'll get back to some of the questions I had. This one is from Lauren McCain. What's your, I would like to ask Representative Schrier if she thinks that Legacy Roads and Trails has strong support from her colleagues, and do they see how the program will benefit their districts?
Yes, this has strong support. In fact, Representative Simpson from Idaho and Derek Kilmer are with me in introducing this bill, and I will have to look to see what support we have from the delegation. What can get tricky is that this may end up going through on a purely partisan, in a purely partisan way, but I suspect that my Republican members of the delegation would also support this. This brings local jobs. It helps our fish habitat. It helps our drinking water, and helps our forests. There's nothing objectionable in this, and it brings investment from outside sources as well. So, you can really amplify the effect of Legacy Roads and Trails by adding to it what other interested groups bring. And the fact that this is all, I guess, shovel ready isn't maybe not a word we use anymore, but this is all shovel ready. This is like, bring your local, excavator up the mountain. We're fixing this. And so these are local jobs. So yes, there is support. There is nothing objectionable about this program, which is great.
Yeah, good. Well, we will do our part to continue to press legislators all across the West, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that this is good for all kinds of reasons. So know that we'll continue to be doing that. I wanted to fast forward, like let's fingers crossed hope that this does become law, and that the Forest Service has an annual funding, and that it's being implemented in regions throughout not only the American West, but even across the country. What's, as you think about our members and the folks listening in, what's the best case scenario for the Legacy Roads and Trails program? And how can the audience folks engage with the Forest Service and even Congress going forward? But I'm thinking more of the Forest Service to ensure that we get the best benefits to wildlife and clean water and fish.
So when you say kind of what's our best case scenario, our best case scenario is getting both bills passed and having over $500 million in this fund. And then it's a matter of working with our partners, working with WildEarth Guardians, working with Nature Conservancy, working with all of the groups who are interested in wildlife habitat, combining forces and amplifying our effects. And so, where we can bring federal dollars, other dollars will follow. And that's my best case scenario, I guess, if you were asking.
Yeah, that's a piece of what I was asking. I also wonder, in communicating to the audience, what's the best way for them to ensure, thinking more about agency engagement, what's the best way for our audience to ensure that it leads to the kind of benefits that the law envisions?
Right. So like for your own states, Yeah, I would say get in touch with your local Forest Service representative and go to bat, lobby. What areas in your state need this work? Where are there roads that need help? Where are there watersheds that need restoration? And advocate in your part of the country.
Great. Always need people to engage with the Forest Service at the regional and local level to remind them that this is a part of their job. So I want to be mindful of your time. Going to take just like 5 more minutes or so, and I have a few more questions from the audience. This one is from Chris Vondrek, and he, I believe, says 3.5 trillion over 10 years isn't too much. The Trump tax cuts cost 6.7 trillion over 10 years. Defense and war spending will cost 8.4 trillion over 10 years. The total US budget over 10 years will be 288 trillion. So 3.5 trillion will be 1.2% of that. Would the Congresswoman like to comment on 3.5 trillion relative to these other spending? I like the setup on that question.
That is great setup. That is great setup. And I think that's a really important statement that, you know, we're looking at 3.5 trillion over 10 years. And if you took the military budget, as you did, over 10 years, you're at about 8 billion, trillion. So I think you make an excellent point. And for me, with all of these numbers, I mean, they're almost too big to even fathom. For me, what matters is the investment and what you're going to get for that money. So I think of these dollars as an investment. You know, an investment in our defense budget is an investment in cybersecurity and keeping our country safe. An investment in things like early childhood education, child tax credit, healthcare that's affordable and accessible, bringing down the cost of prescription drugs, and climate protection. Those are investments that are worth their weight in gold, right? That this will pay off. This will pay off in terms of jobs and better productivity and better outcome for our kids. And the payoff will be tremendous. So I look at it as an investment, whether it is 3.5 trillion or 6 trillion or 1.5 trillion, like these are just really good, smart investments. And if we do this right, we get more bites at the apple. And it is not me saying it's too much, just to be very clear. That is Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema who are saying the price tag is too high. And I agree with you. These are important investments. If you want good outcomes, you got to invest in here at home. Got to invest here at home.
Yeah, thank you for your commitment and
I will add, if I could, that I also think it's very responsible to pay for these changes. Like, I'm really pleased that we're not just doing it and adding to the deficit, that we're doing it. We're saying, here's how we're going to pay for it. You know, we're going to, you know, bring the corporate tax rate back to, you know, just barely above what the corporate world requested back before the 2017 tax cut. And so, you know, prior to the 2017 tax cut, I think that the corporate tax rate was about 37%. Corporations asked for 25 to 26%. They got 21. So this would be bringing it back to 26.5. Like, it is, these are reasonable changes that make for a fairer system. And I think that if we're talking about an infrastructure package and roads and bridges, you know, the corporations who use our roads and bridges to deliver things have some skin in the game there. So again, I think it's all about investment and a fairness and a responsibility of saying how we're going to pay for these big changes.
It's great. This is the kind of leadership and vision that our country has been lacking for decades. And I just appreciate hearing you articulate the case, not only for reallocating wealth, but for the prominent role that the government can play in solving societal problems. It's been absent from the national discourse for far too long. So yeah. One more question, and then I'll have a closing question. This one is from Phil Fenner of the North Cascades Conservation Council. The Forest Service says it intends to log the Twisp and North Fork Nooksack watersheds. Haven't been there, would love to go. On a large scale, starting next year, calling it restoration in quotes. The Forest Service hasn't done adequate NEPA in the Nooksack. They say it'll have no significant impact. In the Twisp, they've already cut hundreds of large trees under a fire emergency, again in quotes. Will you help us try to stop these harmful large-scale logging projects?
Let me have my team look into it. Twisp is not in my district, but I think that this definitely needs attention. We've had big fires in Winthrop, and so I think, logging really depends on how you do it. And if they are taking out big trees for economic benefit that are not helping with forest health, then I think that is one question to address. If they took them out because of immediate fire danger, that's a different question. Our goal would be to forest small and medium diameter trees, have a small diameter mill to help produce cross-laminated timber and other wood products that could help us build and be less reliant on overseas steel. So it would be a win for healthier forests. It would be the smaller underbrush sized trees that increase fire danger. And it would also be an economic benefit to the area. So let me have my team check in with, I believe that would be Susan Dalbenne's team.
Great. I hope Phil also, excuse me, it wasn't, what was the name? I've lost the chat box there. Well, I hope that you reach out to your staff and get connected. A cute question that I just see, and then a final question. Just curious where the congressman would like to go fishing. This is from Jessica Helsley.
Oh my goodness. Middle Fork of the Snoqualmie, the Yakima, boy, up in Winthrop, beautiful fly fishing there too. I guess my bigger question is not so much where, but when will I get the time to go do it? So
I don't imagine you have too much free time even when you're back in district. And so just one final question before you go. I'm curious to hear, and this is through the lens of your optimistic worldview. What's it like in Congress now? There's a lot on the line. Things seem polarized. And you've only been at it for 3 years, but what's it like in this moment? And what do you see as the prospects for Americans' faith in Congress rising instead of diminishing?
Yeah, it does sometimes feel like Congress is broken and like bipartisanship is lost. And these big bills, when we're talking about Build Back Better, they're probably going to be very partisan bills, even though there's lots of good things that everybody can like in there. Sometimes heels just get dug in. But, I think that functioning effective government is something that will be cumulative, like it will have a snowball effect. So, if we can get this done and give families a break by helping them raise their children and get universal pre-K so our kids do better, have the first 2 years of apprenticeship or career technical education covered, then I think that will make a meaningful difference in people's lives and hopefully restore some of that faith that government, when run well, can really deliver meaningful results to people's lives. And I think we need that. I think we need a reminder, just like we had with the rescue plan, like a reminder that government can do some things that nobody else can do. And so whether it was things like the enhanced unemployment or the PPP program for small businesses, the private world can't do that. And because of those investments in the rescue plan and keeping people afloat, our economy is rebounding faster than any other. So let's restore some faith that when government is run well, we can really do some amazing things.
Well, thank you for that. I want to believe in government, and I'm grateful for those people, whether in the agencies and the institutions that help implement government's vision, or those elected officials like you who bring your optimism and belief and all the hard work day in and day out to enact lots of good bills that, again, restore faith in our American democracy. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to allow you to get back to work or wherever you need to go. And we're going to have Marlise and Jess talk a little bit more about the Legacy Roads and Trails program. So thank you again, Representative Schrier.
Thank you. And thank you for your advocacy. And it's so good to be able to work together and to have, these dollars and these grants go to places where we can collectively help our wildlands. So thank you very much. It's wonderful to talk with you all.
Thank you.
And happy birthday.
Thank you.
Bye.
My birthday just, got better. I got wished a happy birthday twice by Representative Schrier. So Jessica and Marlise, good to have you. Listening in on the first half hour, what stood out most for each of you? And why don't you go first, Jessica?
Yeah, I think it should be no surprise that Representative Schrier made a direct connection between ecosystem health, right, given her background as a physician. And I think ecosystem health and human health are directly linked. And I think we couldn't provide any better argument to that than what we've seen during the pandemic, in just an astronomical increase in the use of our national forest lands or parklands, federal owned property, by folks trying to sort of get the healing that nature can provide. And then to look at legacy roads and trails and how that funding directly results in road creation to get folks from point A, to point B, I think is absolutely critical. So that to me was a key moment. Was her connecting that, and then of course when she said she wanted to go fishing. So that's a shoe-in for me, obviously.
Love that, and thank you for that question. Marlise, what struck you most?
That hit me, as well as the ecosystem connection and the health of our watersheds, and how that links to all of us. And drinking water, and water is a passion of mine. And so I feel like I'm always screaming, like, why aren't we paying attention to water? So it was great to hear her say that. And then the other thing too is when she talked about remedying some of the damage done, that also really resonated with me. I look at Legacy Roads and Trails as a healing program, and I, that's also very exciting to work on, as something positive. And there was some damage done, and let's go and heal it, and look towards the future. And so I appreciated hearing her talk about that as well.
Cool. Thank you both. I'll just answer my question briefly. I was struck by her optimism, because I have this impression that some people go to Congress just to fuel the cynicism and to sort of attack the institution. I don't have that belief. It's true. I mean, and so I don't just have that belief. It's true. So it's lovely to see someone actually believe in government and work to make government serve the people. So Jess, can you talk about some of your work and why a program like Legacy Roads and Trails is so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that may not be familiar, the Wild Salmon Center focuses on protecting salmon that are still doing well, salmon strongholds throughout the Pacific Rim. And I focus specifically in Washington State. And so many, as I think you mentioned in one of your questions or your introduction, John, there's so many miles of road systems, not just throughout Washington State, but throughout the United States, that have sort of dissected our waterways. And in many places, salmon cannot access the clean, clear, cold waters of their headwater streams due to some of those road systems. Or as the Congresswoman mentioned, we're seeing roads that are washing out, contributing significant amounts of sediment to the stream. So I have the wonderful pleasure of dancing between policy and on the ground implementation. And that is removing barriers, fish passage barriers through our cold water connection campaign, or decommissioning roads within the Olympic National Forest and other places. And for us, legacy roads and trails is one of those critical sort of puzzle pieces of funding sources that has been available sort of at varying funding levels throughout the years. We never tend to see the quantity of funding that, of course, we would all like to dream about. And so practitioners on the ground are sort of forced to, fit these multiple funding sources together to be able to execute a project. One prime example of that is some road decommissioning work that was just finished up on the Sitcom watershed and the outer coast of Washington State and the Olympic National Forest. And so that's why legacy roads and trails is so critical for us. It's just one of those big puzzle pieces, and plus it means I get to work with Marlise whenever I can. So that's also a good bonus.
Oh, cool. I love jobs that sit between, as you described it, kind of the policy and then the on the ground practice. I actually think that every environmental group should try and do that. It's hard to do that. And I think about actually the agencies too, like they push way too much paper. And I know that's a function of the environmental regulatory world that exists, but we all got to get out on the ground. So I'm envious of your job. Marlise, Jess touched on this, but micro and macro, how does restoring national forest lands and waters happen at the macro and the micro level, as sort of seen through your work?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that and kind of upscale it a little bit, because I saw someone in the chat asked whether this was only a Western program. It is a national program, and what really happens at the micro level is, what Jess said is, there's particular watersheds where there are projects that need to happen that improve clean water, that improve biodiversity, that connect corridors for wildlife. And those projects happen, mile by mile, one culvert here or a quarter mile of road decommissioned here. And that's really, small scale, but it's looking at those, larger connections for whether it's salmon or grizzly bear or trout or inland trout, if you're in Montana or another state. And then at the macro level, it's looking at, ecological function as a whole. So you have, large river systems from headwaters to the valleys and estuaries and large landscapes, and how the species move through them and how the water moves through them. And then you overlay how people are accessing forests and the roads that get them there. And those roads were built over half a century ago for an entirely different purpose. And so at the macro level, Congress and the Forest Service and people really need to get smart about, where to invest and, how to unravel some of that harm that was done in the past. But, also invest in, particular roads that people are using to access their national forests and, get rejuvenated in the way that we all need to. So that is, the small scale, looking in your own backyard and the roads and the places that you love to go, but then also thinking about the larger level of how all of these landscapes and water systems are connected.
Well, and I think if I can really fast, it's really important to think about from a conservation perspective too, and that, we all know that we need to sort of grow our rallying support teams to the extent that we can. We need more conservationists in the world today, and we're going to need them tomorrow and into the future. And the more we're able to equitably get folks out safely to these places, whether it's to recreate or to walk or to fish, that really helps us build that cohort of a support system, right? But we need to make sure that that's safe for them to do, because otherwise a trip, nobody wants a trip out to go for a hike to become something where you have to have a big 4x4 truck in order to do that, right?
Yeah. Equitable access is such an important part of building a just world. I appreciate you saying that, Jess. I've got another question for you, but I want to just read from the chat box, just a note of gratitude, and we could all use gratitude because our jobs are hard. So this one's from Patricia Jones. Thank you, Marlise and WildEarth Guardians and Jessica and Wild Salmon Center for helping to save the Olympic National Park and Forest and downstream. So just bathe in that gratitude. I can behave this way a little because it's my birthday. I'm sometimes a little more of a straight shooter, but since it's my birthday. Okay, we're gonna talk about salmon and climate change. Jess, this question is for you. Through the lens of climate change, what are the most significant actions that can and should be taken to ensure that salmon are around for generations to come?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. And really, the sort of challenge when it comes to salmon, right, is that there's two sort of environments that they live in or spend a majority of their time in, one being sort of the freshwater ecosystems and the watersheds that create those, and then the other being the ocean. And while there are definitely actions we can take to help improve our ocean and the changes that it is going through as a result of climate change and other human impacts, we can have a much more expedient and direct impact on those freshwater ecosystems. And so one of the key things that we advocate for right now is access to the cold water refuge that these fish need to ride out the increasingly warm summer heat waves that we're experiencing. And that's where legacy roads and trails and having adequate culverts and bridges plays a key role. In essence, we don't even want those fish to know that they're swimming through a culvert. I mean, imagine, trying to suddenly pull your dog through a tiny tube and having him look at you because that's not where they want to go. And that's sort of a similar experience to a salmon, right? We want that culvert to look just like the stream that they've been swimming in. And that's not just for the fish, right? That's thinking about that downstream health that's been talked about a bit as well. We want the wood and the sediment and everything to be able to move through that system naturally. So I think there's two things, right? One is that, we can fight for legacy roads and trails to get that access to that cold water refuge. You see immediate die-offs, but we also need those fish to sort of acclimatize to these changing conditions. And to me, that's sort of the biggest piece of the pie. The other sort of thing too, at least in Washington state, there's been some great science recently. It's sort of looking at direct human impacts. So think in the more urban setting, right, where we know that debris from tires and brakes that washes into stream systems is causing immediate mortality, right? So I think as a collective whole, we can push Congress to firmly fund legacy roads and trails at a big amount to really help take care of these more pristine watersheds. But then we can also sort of look at our daily life and our daily routines too, to determine how we can sort of lessen our own personal impacts to give the fish a fighting chance.
Beautiful. So important to envision refugia and to make it happen. And I want to say thank you for your work. Just listening to you, it's so important. Marlise, we're going to talk about road decommissioning, which is a critical part of the whole Legacy Roads and Trails vision. We talked about, or I mentioned, 365,000 miles of roads, something like circle the planet 17 times, if I remember that way of getting people to understand how huge the road network is. Road decommissioning can be a sort of political hot potato. Why is it important, and what would you say about road decommissioning?
Yeah, it's there's multiple reasons why road decommissioning is important. First, the obvious one is you talked about the scale. I mean, 375 or 365,000 miles of roads. I mean, it's so large, we can't even put our hands around it. And so what happens is those roads are unmaintained. There's not even anything near a type of budget that would really pay for the maintenance that those types of roads need. So it's, you know, part of a really simple economic equation. Like if you can't fix your whole house because everything's falling apart, what are you going to invest in and fix? You know, maybe that's just half of the house, and then the rest of the house you take apart and, you know, you bring to the recycling area. So that's part of it, is just the economics of it and not being able to really afford that large road network. But the other part of it too is that a lot of these roads, when they were built the simplest way, and a lot of times that's like right next to a river, you know, right up the valley floor. And what that has done is that constrains rivers, and then they are no longer able to move, you know, the way that they're used to. So it kind of constrains the river in one aspect. The other aspect too is a lot of these roads are dirt roads, and so then you have sediment that's coming off of the roads, and particularly salmon and bull trout are particularly sensitive to excess sediment in the streams. Which also affects the hydrology of the stream. So when you decommission a road and you make that decision to decommission it, sometimes you're just taking it out of the floodplain and, you know, putting another road in a better location so that people can still access the forest. Sometimes it's just, you don't need that road anymore. And it has some expensive infrastructure, like some of the culverts just talked about. That costs too much to replace. And then so if you decommission the road, then you can let it rewild again, and you don't have to worry about it. I just want to, you know, acknowledge that, you know, some people are worried about decommissioning, and that kind of gets thrown around in Congress a lot. And I recognize that, you know, some of that is that, like, this fear of loss, you know, this loss of access to national forests. And that can be very real for someone if, you know, their particular road is taken out. So I want to acknowledge that. But in the scale of things, I mean, the amount of decommissioning that happens is less than 0.3% per year. So in the large scale of things, very little of it happens. So I just want to emphasize that it is important, because in some places those roads are in really bad locations, and that problem needs to be addressed.
That reminds me that I want to get all of our participants to sign the action in the chat box, because we want this to happen, and putting a little more pressure on Congress at this time is critical to getting this across the finish line. We've got, so please, everyone, click on the link that was just posted right there, sign our petition, help us put more pressure on Congress. We've got just another minute. We go maybe a minute over. Closing thoughts from each of you. This program's been around for 13 years. It's already provided $500 million. It's making increments of change and some significant on the ground change, not just increments. What's it going to take to really get our arms around the maze of roads and the problems of roads, to really do this at scale? Why don't you each take 30 seconds on this?
I guess I could say a nice, you know, I can say, because we recently completed a really complex prioritization model for culvert removal, because we recognize that there's not enough funding to deal with every single mile of road or every single culvert out there. So which ones are going to give us the biggest bang for the buck? And I think that we need to do that as well across the Forest Service system, utilizing legacy roads and trails funds as the catalyst.
Love that. Cool model. Marlies.
Yeah, I wanted to just add on to that. I mean, some of it is really easy. Like there's an easy start. 5 years ago, the Forest Service did travel analysis. And even though it was kind of done differently everywhere, there's a long list of roads that were identified to be unneeded, and that would be a very easy start. Along with some of that culvert prioritization that Jess was talking about. And then, continuing to bring people out to the forest. This can be a pretty wonky subject, and people don't really think about the dirt road they're driving on when they get to the trailhead until it gets washed out or it's too rutted to actually drive on. But, getting out to the forest and talking about it and learning more. And lastly, I would say, the agency needs to be held accountable to, and to, have some performance metrics and some goals within the agency to meet.
Well, lovely. Thank you both. The whole Legacy Roads and Trails vision is one that just deeply inspires me. I think we need to, I see it as a part of changing the culture of our agency and kind of also changing the relationship between humanity and the natural world from this extractive one to this restorative one. So it's critical work that both of you are doing. And I appreciate the audience and lots of thoughtful questions. Love having Representative Schrier. Thank you again, Marlies, for bringing her to this WildEarth webinar. We're going to be doing a whole series of them on other subjects from all across the West, from wolves to other river issues, Joshua Tree, and a bunch of others in November and December. So I hope that you all will come back. And again, thank you, Jess and Marlies, for your work to make the world a little better and for rewilding and restoring and reconnecting our national forests. So thank you again. We'll see everyone soon. I'm going to go celebrate my birthday.
Happy
Bye-bye.
birthday, John. Thank you, Jess.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.